Do you have a screen that looks like this? If so, chances are great that you've got an EFI issue on your hands. If this small partition breaks, your entire system becomes unbootable, and most people don't actually understand why. Many tutorials jump straight into commands that supposedly fix EFI issues, but if you don't understand why the system is failing in the first place, you won't be able to troubleshoot variations in real-world scenarios. So in this video, I want to start by explaining how modern computers actually boot up, what breaks to cause a problem with your EFI partition, and then how to fix it and actually get your computer up and running again. Note that this video only applies to UEFI systems, not to older MBR or legacy BIOS systems. With that said, let's get into it. So how does a computer actually boot up? What's the process like? When you initially press the power button, the first thing that runs is the system firmware, specifically in this case, UEFI firmware. It initializes the hardware and runs some checks to make sure that everything is running as expected. Its job is not to load Windows directly, but to decide what to run next by looking at root entries that are stored in its non-volatile memory. So each of these entries points to a specific file on the disk, not to a partition, not to an operating system generically, but to a specific file, an EFI file. Now these files live on a special partition on disk called the EFI system partition, or ESP for short. And this is a small FAT32 partition, typically 100 to 300 megabytes, that Windows and other systems use to store their bootloaders and boot configuration files. So in a Windows system, that includes two main files. Firstly, the Windows Boot Manager, and secondly, the Boot Configuration Data Store, or BCD for short. So the firmware follows these boot entries to find the bootloader file and then executes that bootloader file. So control moves from the firmware to the Windows Boot Manager. The Boot Manager then reads the BCD store, which tells it where Windows lives on disk and how to start it up. And so using that information, it loads the Windows bootloader, or winload.efi is the actual name of the file typically. And that file will then finally start the operating system itself. Notice how every step here depends on the previous step. If anything fails early on, Windows never even has a chance to run. EFI-related failures are confusing because the operating system appears broken, but in many cases, Windows itself is really fine. You see, if the EFI partition is corrupted or missing entirely, your computer's firmware has nowhere to load a bootloader from. And that's why you see errors like no boot device found, or the system just loading straight into BIOS. It never has a chance to actually load the bootloader and thus never loads Windows. On the other hand, if the EFI partition does exist, but boot files are damaged or missing, the firmware attempts to launch the bootloader, but in this case it's corrupted and so it fails immediately, still before Windows ever loads. If the boot files exist, but say the BCD is corrupted or misconfigured, the system gets a little bit further in the process. Boot Manager runs, but it doesn't know where Windows lives, and so it produces errors that reference a missing winload.efi file or an invalid boot configuration. Notice the distinctions here. In all these cases, the operating system isn't inherently broken. Problem is in the pre-operating system boot chain, firmware, and the bootloader. So here's how you confirm an EFI problem. If your computer won't boot up, here's how you actually determine whether it's an EFI problem or something else. Start by booting into recovery mode. If you don't know how to do that, start by booting your system up and then hold the power button to turn it back off while it's still in the boot process. Repeat this process at least two, 3, 4 more times until it says that it's booting into recovery mode. Once you get into recovery mode, it should look something like this. So we're going to go to Troubleshoot, Advanced Options, And we want to open up the command prompt. So the first thing that we want to do is actually check the EFI partition to make sure that it even exists. So to do that, we're going to start with a couple commands. Let's say disk part, enter. Then we're going to list all of the disks that are currently hooked up to the computer. In this case, we have only got the one disk, disk 0, and my current disk is 100 gigabytes in size. So we're going to select that disk, select disk 0. If you had several disks, if you had a disk 1 or disk 2 that you needed to select, you would just change this disk 0 to whatever number disk you actually needed to select. So we're going to select disk 0 here, and then we're going to list all of the partitions that are on that disk. Now, we've got 5 separate partitions here on my drive. Notice how we've got our recovery partition here. That is the partition that we're currently booted to, the recovery section. We're looking for a small FAT32 partition that's labeled as system. In this case, partition 2. It's called system. It's 100 megabytes in size, so that's the correct size that we're looking for. If you wanted to be extra sure, you could also type list volume, or you could just do list VOL for short, and it would show that volume 2 is the EFI partition, and notice how it is a FAT32 partition. So that just confirms that this is in fact the EFI partition volume 2 is. So we're going to select volume 2. Again, if yours is not volume 2, then just substitute 2 for whatever number you need. And then what we need to do is actually assign, notice how this volume does not have any drive letter assigned to it, like how the Windows has the C letter selected to it. So we need to assign a letter to the EFI partition. So we're going to assign letter equals, and this can literally be whatever letter you want. I'm just going to use E in my case, as long as it's not a letter that's already used up. So in my case, it cannot be C or D. So I'm just going to use the letter E, enter, and then we can exit out of the disk part command line. So then we assigned the letter E to the EFI partition. So now we can actually use that letter to navigate to that partition and actually look at the files inside of it. So we've confirmed that there is an EFI partition. So that is how it should be. If there was not an EFI partition at all, that would be your problem. You would need to create one, and I'll show you how to do that a little bit later. But let's say that in my case, I've got an EFI partition, and so that's not the problem, but it could be that one of the files on the EFI partition is corrupted or something. So if we type the drive letter and then a colon and then enter, notice how we are now on the EFI partition here. We're going to type dir, and that's going to show everything that is on the EFI drive. And so currently it's got one folder, the EFI folder, so we're going to change directories into the EFI folder. And it's got a Microsoft and a boot folder. That's good. We're going to move into the Microsoft and then boot. Again, dir to show all the files inside of it. Again, we've got, so this is our problem here. Right now we have our BCD file, our BCD store, which is a good thing. We need to have that. But there are not actually any bootloader files within our boot directory here, and there should be. You'll remember that I talked about that Windows Boot Manager that the firmware needs to find? Well, it's supposed to live here in the boot directory. It's not there. So that's our issue in this case. If yours has that, then you would keep looking around. You could see whether this BCD store actually exists. Um, and so next thing we could check, you'd say BCD edit store. Use our E drive, EFI, Microsoft. So notice what we did there. We're actually taking, oh, pull that command back up. We're actually opening up the contents of the BCD file that's right here, and we're looking at where it's pointing to load the actual Windows boot manager. So in this case, good. See, notice here how in this same folder, there's supposed to be a boot mgfw EFI file, and it's obviously not there. There's only a BCD store. So that's part of our issue right there. So we keep scrolling down our Windows bootloader, which then will in turn launch the Windows operating system. It's actually in the Windows 30 or the System 32 directory on our main partition. And so that I guess next we could make sure that this file is actually where it's supposed to be as well. So we could, if we move to our C drive, and then we're just going to navigate to that Windows System 32 location. So we're going to go to C, Windows, System 32, and let's see if that winload EFI file is in there. There's going to be a lot of contents here. It's listing everything that is in that System 32 directory. Once we get towards the bottom, it should list the winload.efi file. All right, let's scroll up a little bit here. SQL, WinSpool, and there it is, winload.efi. So that's pointing to the correct spot as well. So it's good to go in that regard. So with that said, we found our problem here. We know that our EFI partition has a problem. There's no bootloader file on it. No Windows boot manager. So easiest way to fix this, and if you're pressed on time, you don't need to necessarily go looking. It can be hard to find the exact error that's in your EFI partition. So if you don't want to go searching for it, this command that I'm going to show you next, it's going to fix all of these potential problems all at once. So if you just want to know how to fix the problem, how to fix your EFI partition all at once, here's how you do it. All right, so now we understand a little bit of what causes EFI partition problems in the first place, what causes things to break. So the real question is, how do we actually fix this problem? How do we get our computer up and running again? First step is to use the diskpart command, enter the diskpart prompt. Our goal is to find the EFI partition and select it. So we are going to list all of our current disks. I only have the one disk 0. If you have several disks listed here, then you would just find your primary one, the one that your EFI partition should theoretically be on, and you would select it. So I'm going to select disk 0, select disk whatever you need. If not 0, then 1 or 2 or 3 or whatever. Select disk 0. We're going to list all volumes, and my EFI partition is volume 2 in this case. It's 100 megabytes. It's a FAT32 partition. It's definitely my EFI partition. So I'm going to select volume 2. Again, you select whichever volume applies to your system. Select that guy. And now what we're going to do, that we've got this volume selected, we're going to completely wipe wipe this partition, we're going to reformat it, and we're going to build it from the ground up so that we are starting with something fresh. This should eliminate any of the issues that were there before. So we're going to format with a FAT32 format. All right, it's formatted. Easy as that. So now we are going to assign a letter. We're just going to assign a drive letter to it. In my case, I'm going to do E. You can use whatever letter you want to use instead of E here. You can use E. The only thing to watch out for is that you do not use one of the letters that is already used for another one of your partitions. So in this case, I could not use the letter C or D. So I'm just going to use E in my case. All right, so we have successfully formatted our EFI partition. So we're going to exit. And now notice here how if we navigate to our E drive or EFI partition and then use whatever letter you use and we show all the contents of it, you'll see there's nothing in it. File not found. Are no more files in the EFI directory because we completely reformatted it. So to recreate it, we're going to use bcd boot. And first, we're going to point to where the Windows operating system should live on our computer. In my case, it's on my C drive in the Windows directory. That's almost always the case. And then we're going to point to our EFI partition, where it should be, where it should live. In my case, that's the E drive. And we're going to tell it to create an EFI partition. And what this is going to do is copy bootloader files to the EFI partition. It's going to rebuild the BCD store. It's going to register a valid UEFI boot entry in the firmware, all of the stuff that we talked about in the beginning. So now, if we show the contents of the E drive, you'll notice there's now an EFI directory. And we can actually navigate to EFI, Microsoft, boot, where the bootloader file should live. And we can show the contents. And notice how now we've got all these contents, and there is our bootloader EFI file. Down here is our BCD store. So this is how the EFI directory partition should look. So at this point, we should be able to restart our computer, boot it up again, and assuming that the issue was the EFI partition in the first place, then our computer will boot right. For contrast, consider a failure where winload.efi is missing on the OS partition. It would look something similar to this. Notice how it says that your device or PC needs to be repaired. It still won't boot up, but now it's actually pointing to file that is on the Windows System 32 directory. And so this is no longer an EFI issue. It's actually giving us an error code. So this is something that is part of the operating system now, an issue with the operating system rather than the EFI partition. So here, the EFI partition and the boot files, they're fine. The failure happens later in the chain. And so understanding where the chain breaks is what really allows a technician to choose the right fix rather than applying EFI solutions blindly for a boot problem, because in this instance, using what we just discovered would not fix the problem. Rebuilding the EFI partition would not fix this problem because that's not the issue. So the main takeaway is this, that EFI problems are not about Windows itself failing. They're about the system not knowing how to reach Windows. And so by understanding the boot chain, that's firmware to the EFI partition, to the bootloader, to the BCD, to the Windows operating system, or any other operating system for that matter, you can diagnose effectively as a technician and fix a wide range of non-booting scenarios with confidence. Now, if you're new to the help desk and you freeze every time the phone rings, or if you never know what to say to a customer in order to sound genuine, or maybe you've been in the help desk role for a while now and you just want to increase your overall confidence or productivity on help desk calls. If that sounds like you, I wrote a free guide. It's called 5 Steps to Handling Help Desk Calls with Confidence. And I wrote it specifically for people wanting to increase their abilities and performance on the help desk. You see, it's great to know about IP addresses, about hard drives, VMs, all other things tech related, but if you are lacking in your soft skills and you don't know how to earn people's trust while you're helping them to solve their problems, every single ticket that you work on becomes harder than it needs to be. Because ultimately, every single ticket you work on involves working with the customer. You can download the guide on my website, movintotech.com. I'll put a link in the description down below this video. That's all for now, though. Get out there, solve some tickets.